So I'm recording my homily for the third Sunday in Lent, and as you can tell from the background, this is definitely not Washington State. So I came down to Arizona for just a few days of vacation. We're just outside Phoenix, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and even though it's too late, I thought, it kind of ties in with Lent and Jesus going out into the desert, so it's kind of beautiful here, just going out, just the starkness of it. But also, everything's already starting to grow. There's a beauty of it that life is coming, right? So the gospel this weekend is about the Samaritan woman at the well. A powerful story of conversion, just the whole process of how a person goes from being very hard-hearted to opening, and then to receiving, and then to just being passionate, just absolutely dying to spread the word. If we're tempted to think that this is only for people who are converting to the Catholic faith, then that would be an error. It is for people who are converting to the faith. But I also think in a very powerful way, this gospel is for us who are cradle Catholics, for the people who were born and raised Catholic and never thirsted, right? There's an element, there's a temptation, speaking of temptations in the desert, there's a temptation for us as cradle Catholics to think that we're almost entitled, that we were born and raised with the faith, and we almost can just kind of sit back and retire as Catholics, and we don't have to do a whole lot. And often, you'll even hear this in how we speak of our faith, but it's almost like we look for the minimum. What is the minimum I have to do to just squeak by? Maybe just to slip into purgatory, or just to barely slip into heaven eventually. And then we'd miss the whole point of why Jesus came. And so to thirst, to really desire. And so that's why we enter into the story in that context of saying, maybe as cradle Catholics, there's something really powerful for us. We just celebrated the feast day of St. Patrick, and you know the story of St. Patrick. And so, St. Patrick, he was not Irish, right? He was British. He was from Great Britain. And so as a young man, as a teenager, he was kidnapped and he was taken into slavery in Ireland. He was based as forced labor. We call it, he was shanghaied, right? He was taken. Can you imagine for his parents to have him just disappear and to never see him again? Just how devastating that would be. And so you enter in the story of St. Patrick, and so he's kidnapped, he's taken into Ireland. Now you have to believe, this is how God works. He doesn't stop something bad from happening, but he does try to create opportunities for us to soften our hearts and open our hearts. And maybe this is exactly what Patrick needed. Maybe he was going to be your typical cradle Catholic who was going to live his faith in a very superficial way, and this is what he needed to kind of wake him up. And so he gets separated from his family. Now the reason I think that is because a couple years later, when he escapes and he goes back home, he begins to discern the priesthood, his vocation, his calling. And I can't help but think that something changed in his life. Something happened. There was a desert experience that forced him to wake up spiritually. So he comes back home. He begins to discern his vocation to the priesthood. And in the process of that, there's this time when he's starting to think, well, where am I going to be a priest? Where am I going to live my faith? And you can imagine in his conversation with his bishop, but also conversation with the Holy Spirit, that he started to feel this impulse. And this impulse to love his enemy. And so his enemy would have been the Irish, because they were the ones who kidnapped him. And you can imagine, having been kidnapped, that's the last place in the world you'd want to go back. It's like, I'm done with that. They're my enemy. I'm back home. I'm safe. I don't never have to worry about that again. But that's not how God works. And so in that movement of the Spirit in his heart, as he's thirsting more to grow closer to God, God throws us out into the world with that thirst, with that that ability to be a font of living water, right? So our thirst, as we drink, sends us out to help others who are thirsting. So he goes back to Ireland as a priest, as a missionary. He goes back to his enemy with this love for his enemy. And it's beautiful how he just pours himself out. And so, if you're thinking, why was St. Patrick a saint? It didn't have anything to do with snakes. Speaking of snakes, being here in the desert, keep my eyes open, right? It had nothing to do with the snakes in Ireland. It had nothing to do with the three-leaf clover. It had to do with the fact that he modeled, he manifested what it meant to truly love. And that's what converted the people, right? That's what converted Ireland. And so Ireland became just this bastion of Catholicism, bastion of Christianity. They had missionaries coming out their ears. They were sending Irish missionaries to every single corner of the world. Our own diocese of Seattle had many, many Irish priests and sisters come to the diocese as missionaries. It's magnificent. But how's the faith in Ireland doing right now? The faith in Ireland is dead. It's dying. There's nobody going in the seminary. They have no vocations. People aren't going to Mass anymore. And so you wonder, it's like, how did that happen? How did they go from being so strong to now it being non-existent? And this is one of the reasons why I want to get at today. We as cradle Catholics have to always remember to thirst. Now, at one of the Masses, it was wonderful. As I asked that question, how did the faith die in Ireland? This gentleman yells out at Mass. He yells out and he says, it was the British. Now, after Mass, he explained that he said, the Irish people were persecuted. And I agree with him. They were persecuted, very, very much so. But that doesn't kill faith. That doesn't stop the thirsting. If anything, that should increase faith, right? When we're persecuted, our faith grows. But something happened where that stopped happening. They stopped thirsting. They stopped loving their enemy. And so it's true, it was the British. The British was their enemy, but they stopped loving their enemy. And so the Irish Catholics were not known for love of enemy. They were known for hating their enemy. They were known for being extremely vindictive and to become vengeful. And so the faith died. They stopped loving their enemy. Now, Archbishop Fulton Sheen used to say that the Catholic faith is always, always one generation away from dying and one generation away from being reborn. And so we want to thirst, we want it to be reborn, right? Now, in the gospel today, it starts out in a very peculiar way, and it's very subtle, and you may not catch it if you're not looking for it. And it's how John begins the gospel today. He begins by setting the scene, and he doesn't jump right into the Samaritan woman and Jesus in Samaria near this well. He explains the well. He says, this well is near the plot of land that was given by Jacob to his son Joseph. Why does he mention Joseph? Joseph has nothing to do with this story. But there's something there for John. There's a spiritual connection. And so let's go back into the story of Joseph. So Joseph, this is Joseph from the Old Testament, right? This is not Joseph, the husband of Mary. So Joseph in the Old Testament was very much favored by his father. He was a prophet. He had something very special about him, and his father clearly favored him. And so his brothers, who would become the tribes of Israel, his brothers hated him for it. They were jealous. Right? And so one day he's out with his brothers, and his brothers are just fed up with the fact that he's being favored by his parents. If you ever felt that by your parents, where your siblings were favored, you know what that feels like. So they decide to kill him, right? Well, how are they going to kill him? They decide to kill him by throwing him down a well. And where's the setting of the gospel today? It's by the well of that plot of land for Joseph, right? They're going to throw him down this well. Now, you almost have this image of Jesus Christ dying he becomes the new living water, right? He gets thrown down the well. He becomes the new living water. And so Joseph, you have an image of that. Now Joseph, in the end, is not killed by being thrown down a well. Instead, his brothers decide to take him back out and sell him into slavery. And so the symbolism of the well is still there, but they then send him into slavery. They sell him into slavery, so they make some money off of their brother. Now, you also have the image of Jesus being sold by Judas, right? For 20 pieces of silver being sold out. So he gets sold into slavery. They send him to Egypt. Well, lo and behold, God's at work in Joseph's life. And Joseph probably would have had no sense of that. He probably thought his life was over. How could he possibly be the favored one where here he is, his life is just a mess. He's sold into slavery. Now, do you hear St. Patrick in this? St. Patrick was sold into slavery, right? And yet God was at work. And you know, the reality is, and St. Ignatius of Loyola, who did the spiritual exercises, he would say, until we surrender, until we allow God to be in control, we will never truly thirst. We will never trust. Okay, so we go back to Joseph. Joseph sold into slavery in Egypt. Now, how God is working? Well, his brothers stay in Israel, but they have a famine. And so they go to Egypt one day seeking help because they're dying. And who's in charge now? Joseph. Joseph is in charge of all the supplies for the kingdom of Egypt, because he rose through the ranks. And here his brothers come, and he knows that these are his brothers. And you know, it's like if he had just given in to the desire for vengeance, he could have killed his brothers. He could have made life horrible for them. But there's this moment, this powerful moment, when he is just weeping because he so desires to be reconciled with his family, with his brothers. Love of enemy. The people who tried to kill him, he loves them. He truly loves them. So he thirsts for reconciliation. It's powerful. Now, let's use that and go into the story today of the Samaritan woman and Jesus. So this is a model of conversion, and I want to take us through step by step. And forgive me if I get some of the details a little mixed up, but they're all there. The components are there. And so let's start with how Jesus starts the conversation, because this is often how he starts with us. And so he sees the woman coming up to the well, and he says to her, "Give me a drink." Now, all of a sudden, you got to get thrown on your back, because it's like, wait a minute, God thirsts? God thirsts for her? God thirsts for me? So when we are closed off, our hearts are hardened, and as cradle Catholics, that can actually become fairly easy, because we become lukewarm, we become self-righteous, whatever it may be. Our hearts become hardened. And then Jesus comes in and says, "Give me a drink." Now, what is he saying? What he's saying is that by our baptism, by the fact that we are children of God, sons and daughters, we are fonts. We are meant to be fonts. And he provides the water, but we are the font. And so when the water is flowing, Jesus can say, "Give me a drink," and we have water. But what if the font becomes plugged, right? What if the font is no longer working? It becomes dried up. And so that's how Jesus begins to awaken us and to make that font work again. And so he says, "Give me a drink." And so the woman at first, she obviously doesn't get it. She doesn't know what he's talking about. But she has the same response that we often do when Jesus first comes to us and says, "Give me a drink." We often put the wall up and say, "No," right? Now, how does she do it? She throws back in Jesus' face the hatred that exists between the Samaritans and the Jews. Now remember, the Samaritans used to be Jews. They were part of the Jewish kingdom. They were part of the Israelites. But the north was where Samaria is. They went astray. They went off and embraced all the gods and all the cultures of the people of that age, and they had been conquered. Whereas the Jews who persevered were from the south. And so Jesus is from the south, from Jerusalem. And so it's the north and the south. And so the woman from the north is saying, you're not even supposed to talk to me, right? And you can imagine for us, sometimes in our own lives, is when we put that wall up. So parents, you can think about this maybe when your kids are here, their hearts are hardened, they don't want to go to church anymore, and they don't want Jesus anymore, and they're totally embracing the ways of the world, and you're trying, you're saying, come on, and they put up the wall and they say, don't even talk to me about it. I don't want to hear about Jesus. Don't even talk to me. So that's what she does. Now, she's pretty snotty. I mean, she's very rude to Jesus. She has no desire. And we've all talked to people who are like that. The wall just immediately goes up and they say, don't even talk to me about faith. I don't want to hear it, especially about the Catholic Church, right? So, does Jesus give up? Of course not. He's going to keep looking because he wants that font, not the well, but her, to become alive again and to flow. So he keeps at it. So what does he do next? He begins to form some questions. They're like questions because he's trying to get her to think. And he's basically asking her, do you know God? How does he put it? He says, do you know the one who could give you water? Do you know the one who can give you water? Do you know God? What a great question, especially somebody whose heart is hardened. That may be a question where it can just cause a tiny crack to form in that wall. Do you know God? Not do you know about God? Do you know God? So, her response is still pretty snotty, and she has this conversation, and it's like, what are you talking about? I come here for water, leave me alone, I'm just going to get my water, and I'm going to go back home, right? But he's speaking in such a manner that it's going to perhaps just slowly open up her heart. Well, the conversation continues, and so Jesus very subtly begins to teach her. And he begins to teach her about the one who desires to give her water, who desires for her to be a font again. And she's still being snotty, and she says, how can you give me water? You don't even have a bucket, right? She's got a bucket. She's prepared. He doesn't have anything. How can he give her anything? So he's subtly trying to teach her. But she's still closed off to it. He doesn't give up. Now you can almost imagine what she's saying because she knows what's in her heart. She knows what's in her past. So does Jesus, but he hasn't brought it out yet. And she has like this 747 airplane full of baggage in her life. And he doesn't even have a bucket. How on earth is he going to help her? How's he going to break through all of that pain and all of that hurt? Where is he going to even begin? He doesn't even have a bucket, right? But he's very patient. He works very subtly. So he keeps talking to her. And then he does what he often does with us. He forces that little crack to open up a lot farther. And so he names the wounds. He names her pain. He names the things in her life that have caused her heart to be hardened. He names the problem. He names the reason that her font is plugged, can't flow. And so he tells her her sins. She knows her sins, but she's buried them. She's hidden them. I often tell people in confession, I say, secrets kill, right? Secrets in a marriage kill. Secrets in our lives, they kill. And so God wants to pull that secret out. He wants to name it because that's where the healing has to happen. That's why the sacrament of reconciliation is just so powerful. So he names her sin. Now, this causes her to really begin to open up. And so here's what I would say. There is no way to be converted to Jesus Christ and to not look at our sinfulness, to not look at our past, to not look into our hearts. And it's not that Jesus wants to make us feel horrible. He wants to heal us. It's beautiful. So he begins to do that with her. Now you can tell immediately her heart opens up because she begins to then ask questions. And so that's one of the attributes of a disciple. That's one of the attributes of somebody who thirsts, is they constantly want to learn. And so she begins to say, I know that one day a Messiah is going to come. I know that one day a Messiah is going to come and save us. And it's like she knows that maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something that that's happening that's really powerful with Jesus. And so she kind of lobs it out there to think, is it possible? Is it possible? And Jesus says, I am that one. I am the Messiah. I am the one whom you seek. I'm the one whom you thirst for. Now, right then, and this is very interesting because right then, the disciples come back. They were out shopping for food, right? And so she kind of sees this natural break, this moment, to run back into town. But it's not in fear, it's not in anguish, it's not in sorrow, it's in excitement. She immediately wants to go share with the people in the town, and so she has become this disciple. She's become a missionary. Now, the disciples, as they come back and they see him talking to the woman, it's almost like now he needs to do everything all over again, but with the disciples. Because what is their question? Why is he talking to her, right? It's like they don't get it either. And so Jesus then begins to do the whole thing all over again with the disciples because they ask the exact same question she asked. Why are you talking to me? And they say, why are you talking to her? And so he begins to work in their heart. And he talks about it in a way that's a little bit differently, not necessarily in something how we thirst, but in how we hunger. And so he says, I've already eaten. My food is to do the will of my Father and to bring it to its fullness. And they don't get it. They're kind of like the Samaritan woman. They don't get it. She says, well, how are you going to get water? You don't have a bucket. Who brought him food? And so then he begins to teach. And the disciples begin to understand. And do you notice in the midst of all of this, it's in the context of hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews. And so like Patrick, he was called to go love his enemy. Joseph was called to love his enemy, who were his brothers. And now Jesus is manifesting his kingdom, and he's opening hearts on both sides in the midst of the hatred, or the perceived hatred. That's where he works. And so if you ever want to work, if you ever feel like your faith needs to be utilized more, look for enemies, and there's a path. That's where the gospel helps people thirst again and to drink again, to drink of that life-giving water. So he's helping the disciples out, he's teaching them. Well, lo and behold, the whole town then shows up and it starts all over again. But you notice it began with the woman when she told them, guess who I met? Guess who I met? Guess what he told me? He told me everything I had done. He opened my heart. Come and see. It's beautiful. Conversion. He wants to use you and me, but first he needs our font to flow. He needs us to be a source of life-giving water here in the world. And when we do that, he places us, just like that well was placed right where it needed to be, to bring people together, to bring about conversion. All right. I hope you're having weather as beautiful as this. God bless.